starting it. Date is October 3, 2012. We are in the Isaac C. Griswold Library in Whitehall, New York. We are interviewing Carlton Davis, World War II Navy pilot in the Pacific Theater. In addition to Mr. Davis, we also have his son-in-law Lee Smith, and from the Whitehall Historical Society, Carol and Wayne Senecal, Ray Brown, and Gary Hart. I'd like to start before the war. Where did you go to school?
I grew up in Brayton, Massachusetts. It's a suburb of Boston, and went through high school there. And after high school, I went to night school when I first got out of high school in 1940. And I went to work in the shipyard there in January of '41, and attended night school 1 year at Franklin Technical Institute, and the next year at Lowell Institute, which is an evening school at MIT. Was studying mechanical design, and then, of course, December 7th, '41, Pearl Harbor, and then everything changed. So in the spring of '42, I applied for aviation cadet with the U.S. Army Air Corps, and I went through all the tests, physical and otherwise, and they sent me a paper that I had my mother to sign. I was, at that time, I was probably 19 years old. But one of my buddies I was talking to in the neighborhood, he informed me that the Navy would now accept aviation cadets without a minimum of 2 years college completed if you could pass their examination. So I filed the Army Air Corps application instead of taking it back, and started all over again with the Navy.
How did you decide to go into aviation?
Why did I start? Oh, yeah. I always liked flying. When I was a kid, I had a book, a little booklet that I read showing you how to fly. I used to tell the kids, and they'd laugh at me, They said, "Oh, Carlton knows how to fly. He read a book." But I always was interested in it. So I completed then, and I was sworn in on the 3rd of July, 1942. Yes, 1942.
Did you have any other brothers and sisters that were in the service during the war?
No. Most of my two older brothers and sister were much older than me. I was the youngest in the family. My next older brother, he worked in the shipyard too, but he had an exemption during the war because when I left, he was the sole supporter of my mother. So he went in after the war, after I came back home, but that's all that was in the service.
Where did you go for training?
Training? While when we first enlisted, there was a backup at the pre-flight school. The pre-flight school was in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So while we were waiting, they sent us to the University of Rhode Island, no, it was Rhode Island State College at that time, to go through a CPT program, which is a civilian pilot training program that all the colleges ran, and I think they still do. And we went down there and completed our work at the school, except for the flying. We couldn't, usually it's you study, you fly, you study, you fly. But the college was too close. You couldn't fly within 40 miles of the coast during the war unless you were a military or scheduled airliner. So we did all the groundwork first, the school work, and then we went up to Concord, New Hampshire, and did the flying on skis. And skis are better than wheels because they're more forgiving when you land. But we finished that, and we got a private pilot's license, and there still was a backup, so they sent us out to Fitchburg State College and went into the intermediate program, and we went through another program. It's the same way of flying, but then we would fly in the morning, study in the afternoon. Half of the group, the other half would study in the morning and fly in the afternoon. So, and the time we finished that, within a couple of weeks, we got called and went down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, for a pre-flight school, which was probably about 60 or 70% physical, and the other was military training and aviation-related training, engines, navigation, and so forth. And so we spent the spring down there, and by that time we went from there to Glenview Naval Air Station, just north of Chicago, for the actual Navy training. At the CPT we had civilian instructors, but we went, when we got out to Glenview, that was a Navy station, and we had naval instructors, and we flew the old N3N, we used to call the Yellow Peril, biplane, and we spent the summer out there. And from there we went down to Texas, Corpus Christi. They had two main training stations, facilities at that time, the Navy, one at Pensacola and one at Corpus Christi. And we went to Corpus Christi and took an intermediate course. We flew a SNV, which they used to term the Multi-Vibrator, for reasons you knew as soon as you got in it. And we flew that for intermediate training and also for instrument training. We had an instrument course, and we finished the instrument course, and then we went on to advanced training, and we flew the SNJ, which is getting a little more powerful. That was about a 600 horsepower engine, low wing monoplane, you know. And we flew that for advanced training right up until the time we graduated. When we graduated from there, then we got reassigned. Some of the trainees went to the Marine Corps. You could opt for the Navy or Marine Corps, whichever you chose. And so I opted for the Navy because it seemed by that time it's getting along in the war. Most of the action is at sea. And also you were assigned to either flying boat squadron or fighter squadron or dive bomber or torpedo bomber. And so they selected that. You had no choice. You went where they sent you. So I went in the fighter squadron, went down to Melbourne, Florida, and that's where we first flew the actual combat type aircraft. And we had the F6F3 at that time.
And how did they, during training, how did they prepare you to fly off and onto during training, how do they prepare you on flying on and off the aircraft carriers?
Well, after we finished down at Melbourne, Florida, flying the F6, then we went to Chicago again, back to Glenview. And they had two ships that before the war had been passenger ships that toured the Great Lakes. And the Navy took those over and converted them to carriers, if you will. They were paddle wheelers, actually. And they put a flight deck on them and took the whole superstructure off. And they used them not only to train pilots for landing and takeoff, but to train the deck crews in running the arresting gear and all the other things that go along with operating on a carrier. So we went up to Glenview and a few days of field carrier landings where they have a runway marked off like a deck, and with a landing signal officer. And, but a couple of days of that, and then you went out on the ship, and you had a minimum, I think it was 8 takeoffs and landings, and then they consider you qualified. And then we got 30 days leave, and from there we reported back to San Diego to the fleet headquarters, Pacific Fleet, for assignment.
We've interviewed a World War II service member. He serviced planes, and he's working down in Florida with trainees. And he mentioned a lot of accidents, including some fatalities. Did you have any on your crew? Any accidents in training?
Accidents? Near misses don't count, huh? No, we did most of the training. I don't recall really a serious accident. But like I say, a lot of near misses.
Sure.
But nothing during the training.
By the time you went to San Diego, how many hours did you have training by then?
I'd have to look at my logbook.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if there was a minimum number of hours that you had to have to be qualified for carrier.
Well, it takes so many hours to go through the training syllabus and whatever that was. I don't remember. A long time ago.
So you got to leave after your training. And what about after that?
Then we went back to the West Coast and joined the fleet, and I was assigned to Air Group 1. So that was reforming. They could come back from Pacific. The guys had gone home for a month or so, and they were reforming the Air Group 1 again. So we had a little time, so we stopped off at Navy Auxiliary Field, halfway between San Diego and Alameda, where the Air Group was forming. And we spent a few days there. We got to fly, trying to just keep flying up different planes that, other than what we were qualified in, trained in. But then we went to Alameda, and they started coming in back from leave. And as soon as the whole group was back, we transferred to Fallon, Nevada. They flew us all up there to start training as an air group, to fly together, get used to each other and the tactics and actual preparation for going aboard ship. But before we started flying up there, it was in the late fall. They were having a problem with icing on the wings. This is up at a high altitude, and so while the powers that be were deciding how to attack the problem, we took different lectures and so forth, and groundwork, and the squadron duty officer came in the ready room one day and he says, I need 26 F6 pilots, that's a fighter, F6F Hellcat, the fighter plane, to leave and go directly with the fleet. Well, boy, he got 26 hands before he could finish talking. So before that night was over, we were back in Alameda, 26 of us. And the next day we took off and headed for Hawaii. We landed at Hickam Field, and they bussed us down to Pearl Harbor and out onto Ford Island. We spent the night at Ford Island.
Was there still damage visible from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor?
Was the damage? Oh, yes. Yeah, the one ship that's still underwater there. And, but it was, it didn't look bad by that time, but there was still plenty of evidence there. So we, once again, red tape takes time. So while they waiting for the fleet to come back to Ulithi Atoll. Ulithi Atoll is 500 miles southwest of Guam. And at that time, that was the fleet headquarters, the fleet Anchorage, where they came and went from. So they were out in action at that time. So we spent time at Barbers Point, and we flew whenever we got a chance. And the only scheduled flights we had was we did more carrier practicing. We if they had carriers in the area that were available, we'd go out and do touch and goes. And on the Saratoga, with CV3 was going by, we used that for a couple of sessions, and then we land on the CVL, which is a cruiser hull converted to a carrier that they use a lot for escort work, merchant marine fleet escorts, and also for direct support for the landings, and also a converted tanker, a CVE. And so we made touch and goes on those until we got the orders to head out to the other side of the Pacific, and they flew us out to, we went down to Johnston Island, then we flew over out to Kwajalein, stayed there a couple hours, and flew on to Guam. And we were a couple of days at Guam, including Christmas, and then they had a lot of new planes came to Guam on shipboard. So they trucked them to the airport, reassembled whatever they had unassembled, and made them combat ready. So what we did is the group of us, we ferried 26 of them from Guam down to Ulithi Atoll. And that's how we got the last part of the journey. And then from there we went aboard ship. The fleet was in. They had just returned from the Philippines. And we went aboard ship, which signed to the different ships. And there was, I think, about 3 of us maybe, or 4, went aboard the Lexington CV16. And Air Group 20 was aboard that end, so we were assigned to VF-20. And within a few days, they left port and headed on out.
What was life like on a carrier? How was your food and your quarters?
That's the one nice thing about the carrier. You had food, good food. no C rations and D rations and all that stuff. Life in the carrier is really, of all the ships, that's the most comfortable. It was enjoyable, you know, as far as the ship was concerned. So it was really good duty.
What'd you do for amusement on there?
For what?
Amusement.
AC-doocy. That's the Navy Air Corps unofficial official game. Plus bridge games and stuff like that. And lectures. And we found out then what a Navy pilot was worth. Because during landing operations or takeoffs, the carrier had what they call a plane guard. The destroyer would cruise along just a little bit behind the carrier and off to the port side. And if anybody went in the drink, they'd pick them up, you know. Then when the operation was done, they would rig a breeches buoy from the tail end of the carrier to the destroyer to bring the pilot back. But before he came back, they wouldn't put him in the seat until first the carrier sent over 25 gallons of ice cream. Because the carrier had ice cream freezers and the destroyers is nothing. So we found out what we were worth, 25 gallons of ice cream. And then they get that and then they come back aboard ship.
So you're on the Lexington. What was your first action?
First action?
Action, yeah.
When we left Ulithi and we went up, the invasion of Luzon was underway, and so we went up and attacked and intercepted anything going from Formosa, Taiwan nowadays, down to Luzon. Because bombers could make that flight very easily. So we put duty in there trying to keep planes from heading down to attack the invasion forces there. And that was the first action. And then we went from there, we attacked the Naha airfield, which is on the southwestern tip of Okinawa. And from there we went over to Iwo Jima, because the landings at Iwo Jima were taking place. And we didn't have the direct support, but once again, we were there to intercept any Japanese planes that come in. The main fleet, we were what they called a fast carrier task force. It was Task Force 53 or 58, depending upon who the admiral was, Halsey or McCain. And so we operated as a protection over there. The actual support for the Marines and the Army on the ground was done by planes flying off the small carriers. They didn't have to be as fast as the large carriers because the fleet didn't move that fast. You know. So we flew over there and protect the island. And then we went south, and for the first time in the war, the fleet went through the straits into the South China Sea. Up until that time, the only thing that operated in and out of there was submarines. And we went through the straits in the middle of the night. The minesweepers went through first, and then the ships single file followed through. From there we went to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very busy port for the Japanese we used at that time. So we attacked the ships in the Hong Kong harbor, plus on Kowloon, which is the long peninsula that heads down to Hong Kong Island. We attacked the airfield there to keep the planes down while we were attacking the fleet. And we went down along, after that, the coast of what was then French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, looking for anything that floated. And from there we went back out and back to Ulithi. And spent 3 or 4 days again resupplying and arming and preparing for the next operations. I don't remember exactly which one was next, but the next we went up and along the southernmost Japanese island of Kariushu, and there was a lot of airfields up there, and we spent a lot of time dropping bombs, firing rockets. The actual air-to-air combat by that time was slacking off. Only sporadically would we run into an opportunity to engage in aerial combat. We were mostly trying to keep down the kamikazes. Easter Sunday morning, April 1st, was when, in 45, was when they landed on Okinawa. And so once again, our job was to cover the island and intercept the planes coming down, because what was getting to be a problem is the kamikazes. And they were attacking, especially the invasion fleet. the ships in that fleet. A lot of the smaller ships, destroyers, took a real beating. And so a big part of our job was to neutralize the airfields up along the Ryukyu chain into Kariushu and along the eastern coast of Kariushu to attack the planes on the ground and in general interrupt what kind of operations they had there.
Did you encounter a lot of flak over the airfields?
Flak? Oh yeah. They had all kinds, from 20 millimeter up to 150 millimeter, and they threw everything they had in the air, I'll tell you. But one thing, you see it, but you're intent on what you're doing so that you really ignore it. You can't be bothered by it. You've got a target you're heading for. You go after it, and you're not too aware of what's going on around you. If they hit you, they hit you.
Did your plane take any hits?
Pardon?
Did your plane take any hits?
Oh yes. You often came back with extra ventilation holes. The most potentially dangerous one was I took a 20 millimeter hit in the top of the engine column. It came through the column and hit the armor plate in front of the pilot. And it didn't go through, because they fire, that was 20 millimeters, an explosive shell. What we carried was 50 calibers in the plane, which is non-explosives, just but the shells on the 20 millimeter, they're either armor piercing, which will take them through thicker steel, or high explosive, which explodes. Well, the one that hit me was a high explosive shell, but it didn't explode. It was a dud. A reason I know what it was is because when we get back to the ship afterwards, any ship with damage, they take it right down to the hangar deck. So the mech came to me afterwards and said when they took the cowling off, they found the shell inside. But it hadn't exploded, for which I was very glad. But individual small holes you had all the time.
I believe the Hellcat had a reputation of being very rugged. It could take a lot of abuse.
That's one thing about it. It was rugged. You come back lots of times, the guys are half of the flap missing, a piece of the aileron, and thing still flies. It was the exact opposite. Now the Japanese Zero was a very famous plane, and it was very maneuverable and very fast, but it had its problems. What they had to do was learn what it did and then devise tactics to do what you do better and not what he does better. But they had no self-sealing gas tanks. They carried no armor. Later in the war, they started making heavier planes. They developed one similar to the Hellcat that had armor plate and self-sealing tanks and so forth. But most of the war, all you had to give them was one good burst of 50 caliber, and they blow up.
Is it true they never had parachutes? They never carried them?
The Japanese didn't carry parachutes, no. We had parachutes. The funniest part was when the safety officer in our squadron one time had to bail out. So he put his training to good use. But that was a big part of our work at that time, was trying to hold down the kamikazes. And they would come after the fleet. They attacked us a lot, but we didn't take the beating that the destroyers were taking. Whenever the fleet operated, we had a destroyer probably 30, 40 miles ahead, either side and behind the fleet, as radar pickets. and anything that was heading in, they could pick it up. One time we were sitting on deck, because whenever you're in a danger area, you have planes on the deck ready to go, and you take turns. And our division was up on the deck one day. The basic division that the Navy's fighting is a 4-plane division. Then the squadron is made up of a group of 4-plane divisions. If 4 guys would fly together all the time. And so our division was up there. The division leader was on the port catapult. I was on the right catapult. Then the second section behind us were right ready. So you go up there, you take a book to read, because you're going to just sit there for a couple hours, you know. But the plane is all armed, gassed, ready to go. And all of a sudden, all sort of activity around the deck, you know, and the air officers out there waving at you, so you'd stow everything away so it won't move. And next thing you know, you've got the engine going. The division leader goes off first, and then as soon as he was airborne, the second section leader moved up on, and then they shot me off, and the other guy moved up. So we got in the air. They give us orders to go out over one of these radar pickets, because he picked up something on his radar that wasn't responding. All our planes carried what they call an IFF, identification friend or foe. It was a transponder mounted in the fuselage, and the ship would send out a signal, and the transponder would receive it and send back a signal. And depending on what it came back, they would know it was a friendly plane. If they didn't get a signal back, or the wrong one, then they investigated. So this is where they had one that didn't respond. So they sent us up there, and we went looking for it. And what we found was a twin-engine bomber heading from Okinawa back to mainland of Japan. So the division leader and I took it on. The other 2 guys just stayed up and watched, and we made 2 runs at it and put it in the water. And, but they had these ships out there all the time just for that thing. But sometimes they would still get through. We were preparing for an early morning launch. Some launches were pre-dawn, and that's pretty sticky. But we were on the deck. Pilots are in the planes. We started the engines, waiting to be launched, and all of a sudden, everybody on the deck disappeared. And we got the order in the bullhorn, cut your engines. So some Japanese planes had come in underneath the radar, and they were attacking the ships. And we sat there on the aft end of the ship, and one plane came over us right directly over. He wasn't 30 feet above the deck, and he crashed over on the starboard side. He came in from the port, crashed on the starboard side. If he'd have been 30 feet lower, the planes were all gassed and all armed, and it would have caused mayhem. That's what happened to the Franklin, you know. The planes were all armed on the deck, and they were even carrying what they call Tiny Tim rockets, 21-inch rockets. Most aircraft rockets were 5-inch. And the Japanese plane hit the back end, and that's caused explosions and fire and put the Franklin right out of business. They lost the hundreds on that. But the picket guys are the ones that took the beating, because the Japanese kamikazes come in, they're the first ship they see. And they weren't, you know, the best trained pilots. They would, most of them barely know how to get it in the air. They weren't concerned about landing too much. And first ship they'd see, they'd get a little excited and down they'd go, and the poor destroyers we lost a lot of them. So we spent a lot of time trying to take care of them.
So how long were you on the Lexington?
I was on the Lexington January with Air Group 20. Air Group 20 had completed their time, so they left and went home the end of January when we came back into port. And Air Group 9 came aboard. And we went through another month's operation. When we came back, then the ship went home. So the whole air group transferred to from the Lexington CV16 to the Yorktown CV10. These are both, you know, they started off the war with Lexington. The original Lexington carrier was CV2, second carrier that we had. That was converted, it started as a battle cruiser at the end of World War II, and it was launched in 1922. And the Naval Treaty limited the type of ships you could have. So that was over the U.S. allowance. So they converted it to a carrier. That was sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea. That's the first real aerial naval engagement. The Japanese ships and the American ships never saw each other. But as a result of it, the Lexington was lost, not due to primarily to damage from torpedoes or bombs, but they hadn't learned how to control fires. They had gasoline still in the hoses where they had gassed up the planes. They learned pretty soon that as soon as you gas them, you drain the lines, so you don't have all these gas lines around. Because that's what happened. They were towing the Lexington out of the area to take it back for repairs. When it was loaded with fumes down in the aft end in the compartments, and they ignited and it blew up, so that hopeless. So the destroyers moved in and torpedoed it. But then they renamed one of the carriers that was on the ways being built Lexington, and that was CV10. And the same way, you know, that was the Lexington, they renamed it CV16. The Yorktown, they lost the Yorktown at the Battle of Midway, so they renamed another ship Yorktown. That was, and that's the Yorktown I was on, CV10. But that happened to a lot of the ships.
So you went to Yorktown. When did you get to when did you go onto that ship?
Pardon?
When did you get to the Yorktown?
Where did I get to it? Ulithi Atoll. See, that was the fleet Anchorage. The fleet would depart from there, 3 to 4 week operation. They'd return to Ulithi and do whatever had to be done, repairs, rearm, refuel. Though they refueled at sea too, but so that's where I first went aboard the Lexington, and that's where we went from the Lexington to the Yorktown. When the Lexington had to go back to the States with a cracked rudder that required a dry dock that wasn't available out there, it went back and we changed and went aboard the Yorktown. Then I finished out the tour in the Yorktown.
And what action did you see on the Yorktown?
Pardon?
What action did you see on the Yorktown?
Well, the Yorktown came, we started out in 1st of March. We operated up against Okinawa, against Kariushu. In fact, when Air Group 9 came aboard, they came aboard the Lexington. the first thing that we did, and that would be the 1st of February, the fleet went up and engaged in the first carrier attacks on Tokyo. Now, the Hornet had launched B-25s early in the war, but that was just a token. They took off from the carrier, but they went over to land in China, those that survived. And so this was the 1st of February, was the first full carrier group attack, and we hit Tokyo and its environs. In fact, that was the first operation with Air Group 9, and we lost the Air Group commander. So he took off once and never came back. And they never really knew what happened. Somehow he got shot down. But, then on the Yorktown, we went up in the same area, but not at Tokyo, and we attacked the fields, mostly up and down, and industrial areas. And then with the Yorktown, we were involved in the invasion of Okinawa. And we also, before that, the invasion of Okinawa, a lot of the personnel came up from the Philippines area, and they traveled in not ocean ships, but in the LSTs and that type of ship. The whole fleet of them. So we had the task of accompanying them up. In the daytime, we'd pick them up and follow them along to protect them till they got up there, because they have no protection really against aircraft attack. So that we did that. We did a lot of attack in Okinawa. I know one time we went to Okinawa, and the 4 of us in our division had an area to watch over, and the weather changing. We're in the fog and rain. It's pouring rain. You can't see a thing. But we're flying along hoping we don't meet up with a mountain. And along came 4 torpedo planes. Now the torpedo planes have radio altimeters. The ordinary plane has really an aneroid altimeter that works on air pressure, which changes with the type of weather. So you don't know how accurate it is. But these TBMs, they had radio altimeters. So we snuggled up beside them. And we followed them till we broke out into the clear again. Because one time we were glad to see it. But we did a lot of work in Okinawa, interdicting planes that come down and so forth.
How was it putting these planes on a carrier at night?
They were operating occasionally at night. We had one division that flew night fighters. They had, by that time, we had a few planes that would have a radar dome on one wing. And they still weren't convinced, the Navy, that that's the thing to do. But this one division, they did all the night fighting. And we had a fighter director who was the radar officer on the ship that directed them, you know. He would direct them onto the Japanese plane, and then they could pick it up on the little radar in the plane. But that's all it was for. The one they had in the plane wouldn't search the area. So they were quite successful, really. And but that's all the night flying we did. Though I thought one time that I was going to have to do some night flying. When we had a flight, we were over the south-central part of Okinawa, once again watching out for Japanese planes trying to come in the area. And they got a report of Japanese planes just north of us. So the division leader waves, let's go, and we turned around. Everybody flew, you know, full throttle, went bombing off. That is everybody but me. All I got was a lot of pop, pop, bang, fizz. Engine just wouldn't take the full power. I cut it back to normal cruise. It was fine. So I limped along, heading up to where they went, and they came back about probably 15 minutes later and picked me up and joined up. And by then we were directly over the island, and I just pointed down to the division leader, waved goodbye, blew him a kiss, and took off. I'm going down. And the number 4 man in the division came along with me. You try, if at all possible, never to be alone. Always minimum of 2 planes. So if one guy goes down, there's somebody else chance to know where he is. So we landed and taxied up to the flight line. The mechs come out, chalked it up, and we went into the tower. The Japanese, when they came ashore just west of this Yontan airstrip, the Japanese didn't defend that area. They moved back into the mountains. So the airstrip was fine. The Marines moved in and set up shop, you know, and got a tower personnel to run the tower and so forth. So we went in there, and as soon as you step inside, they pass you a rifle, actually a carbine, small rifle, and we told them why we were there, and they passed us the best of their food, a bunch of K rations and other stuff. Took us out to behind the tower. There was a bivouac area. They had a tent. And signed us to a cot. And the officer took us out there. He says, tonight, he said, when you sleep, keep that carbine on the cot. Not on the floor, on the cot beside you. He says, these guys sneak in here at night, try to shoot the place up, he said, so be careful. But nothing happened, fortunately. Although, within a couple of weeks after time, the Japanese came in at night, flew in, and landed on the airfield and tried to shoot up the planes. And but the trouble that I had was one magneto was gone. We have R2810 is an 18-cylinder engine. It has 2 magnetos, and one of them failed. That's why I had no power. I could run the plane on one, but if you want power, you need them both. So I told the guy, and we went in. It was late afternoon, you know, and we wandered around. As soon as it gets dark, there's only one thing you can do. There's no lights there. You can go in and lay down in the cot and sleep. And we get up in the morning, and I went down, the other guy and I, to the flight line. Oh, all set, says the mech. Oh, good. So I started the engine. The only thing you can do, really, to test it is you run it up to full speed, you turn off one magneto, and you see how far the RPMs drop. Then you bring it up to speed again, shut off the other one, and see how far they drop. They should drop down, you know, when you lose one. And it checked out fine. So, okay, we went in, gave them back the carbine, and they gave us the location of the fleet, and their course and speed, you know, and the wind, the stuff we needed to navigate with. And we got in line, and took our turn, and I pulled out onto the runway, got the green light from the tower, put the throttle to it and started down the runway, and I said to myself, this is not right. This is not right. But what you're going to do, I kept full throttle on, and I got it in the air, But I said, I have two options. I can try to get it back down or try to get around the field and land again. But I said, I'll never make it around. So I cut the throttle and tried to get it. I witched it back down onto the runway. That's the only way I got it down. And as soon as the wheels touch, which is 80% of a good landing, it hit the brakes. You can't hold them, you'll burn them right out. So you just press them, and you get down about 50 feet from the end of the one way and stood on one brake and hoped the thing would spin around, and it did. It made a 180 ground loop, which everybody tries to avoid, and taxied it back up to the line, and the guy jumped up on the wing, the mech, you know. I said, I'm not going anyways until you get another mag in there. He said, well, we would have put a new one in, but we didn't have any. He didn't tell me that before he went. So we got into the Jeep with him. We went across the field and down in the open areas where all the revetments that they used to park the planes in for protection, the Japanese. It was full of all shot-up planes, Japanese, U.S., because planes that were damaged would land on the runway, you know, because and you look for one that had an engine that was still good. The rest of the plane might have been shot apart. So he found one with the same engine, pulled off the magneto, and drove back and put it on. So, okay. Now we got to try this all over again. First try wasn't too good. You don't feel too confident about the second one. But it got in the air, and the other guy followed me, the wingman, and we headed back out for the fleet. We did our navigation in the air on that. There's a navigation board there, which we do. Dead Reckoning was a navigation system that we use, which is an accurate navigation system if you keep within 4 degrees of latitude. If you extend it beyond 4 degrees of latitude because of the curvature of the Earth, of course, things converge and it throws off, and then Dead Reckoning is not close enough. So we did that and headed out, and we would, the fleet is probably 200 to 300 miles off the shore, you know. And we left there. By this time, it's mid-afternoon, and we're heading east, and the sun's heading west. And after a while, you begin to get a little uneasy because it's not too light, and we haven't seen the fleet. We can't go back because we wouldn't get back over the island until after dark. And if you're flying over that island in the dark, they go shooting at you from the ground. They're not trying to find out who you are. And so we said, well, we'll go on. So we continued on, and pretty soon we see a little bump on the horizon, and then 2 little bumps and 3 little bumps, and then you kind of relax a little bit again. And you get up close, and your carrier pulls out of formation, heads into the wind, and we came aboard. But it was a little bit nail-biting and hair-raising trying to get the plane back on the ground. I've never seen that done before, and I wouldn't want to try it again, but it was the only choice we had.
Did you ever encounter any typhoons at sea?
But,
Did you ever go through any typhoons?
yes. Toward the end of the tour, we came through Typhoon. No particular damage to our ship, but I'll tell you, it was rocking and rolling, and that's a big ship to rock and roll. And some of the carriers suffered damage. They had their flight deck, the corners of the flight deck extended out. They didn't have closed bows in those days. The bow was open down to the forecastle deck, and when the ship went down, the waves come up, it broke the corners off of the flight deck, and they were just hanging there. But other than that, we had no problem. The destroyers are the ones that have the problem. They roll about 80 degrees almost in some of those waves. I don't know how they did it. In some of those destroyers, they had pet on board, a dog. You'd see a dog running around the deck. I can't imagine. But they would come alongside us to refuel. Refueling at sea is an interesting thing, actually. When the tanker would pull up next to you, they'd shoot a line across and run the hoses across. And of course, you're not floating on a pond. The ship is constantly either rolling, pitching, or yawing, and usually all three at once. And they've got to keep the hoses out of the water, or it'll tear them right off the mounts. So we always watched when they would refuel. The tanker would come up and it would unload into the carrier, and those guys on the hangar deck of the carrier, they had a line tied to the hose, and when the ships would cut close together or roll, they'd run down toward the stern, to pull the hose up, and then as the ships parted, they'd run the other way to allow more hose out. These poor guys ran back and forth for all the time the ship was refueling. But then, while we're back into the combat area, the small ships, the destroyers, would come over and they would take fuel from us. That's one way they were able to, the refueling operation is really one way to enable the fleet to go where it wanted to. The tankers would be right where we were going. They would get there ahead of us because they knew where we were going, and we'd come up to them. Then they'd take off and get it, because that's not a safe place to be, the tanker. But,
was the Yorktown ever attacked by the Japanese while you were there?
Oh, yes. Well, I told you that once that it flew right over the top of it. And we returned from an operation one time, and the fleet was under attack, which is not unusual. But you have to stay out. They don't allow you to get back in it, because early in the war they didn't, some of these things they had to learn the hard way. The fighters would get on a Japanese plane and follow them right down into the fleet. Well, the fleet has to fire. When it's coming in, it's firing. And we shot down more than one of our own planes. So they learned, when the enemy planes get in close, back off. Let the ships do what they can. So we came back, and the fleet was under attack. We had to circle around outside. And during that time, I think it was a 250 or 500 pound, one of the other bomb came down. It hit the Yorktown on the starboard side. It wiped out one Marine gun crew, traveled inside the ship. It wiped out the parachute riggers' shack, and we lost a couple of parachute riggers and that. Then it veered off again and came out through the hull again, because the bombs, they put a delayed fuse on them, because they want them to get down into the ship as far as it'll go before it explodes. So the thing didn't explode till it was leaving the ship, because it got deflected on the way out. And they lost some more gunners on the crew on the starboard side. And that's the only time we were actually hit, when I was on it. And I wasn't on it. I was flying around waiting to come in. But that produced another dramatic experience, if you will, which is a burial at sea. That's it's a kind of an emotional time, if you will. You realize, they tip up the tip board, bag slides off, you're probably over 15, 10, 12,000 feet of water from there on down. It makes you stop and think a little. But that's the only time we had to do that.
And where were you when the war ended?
When the war ended, I was home. I was home on leave. We came back into June. We went aboard another carrier. We lived on the flight deck on the way home. In fact, there was 2 air groups living on the flight deck in cots. And we went back, the carrier, plus a couple of destroyers accompanied us. We went back to Pearl Harbor, pulled into Pearl Harbor, and then a day later we headed back to Alameda. And then the air group broke up, and everybody got their new orders, whether they would come back to the air group or go someplace else. And then we went home on leave, and that was early August sometime, and we were due back. I was due back in Jacksonville, I think the middle of August, but they dropped the bomb in the meantime. The war ended, so time came, I went back down to Jacksonville, and I walked in. First thing they ask you, you staying in or getting out? I said, getting out. So that was the end. But it took a month to set up the separation center. So we just lolled around for a month. We'd get a plane, we'd take it and fly it out to one of the runways. It's on one of the islands, you know, and sit there and gab a while, fly back.
Did you join any veterans groups or attend any reunions?
No. I started to join the reserve because there's a reserve base not far from my home, but my wife wasn't too happy about me continuing flying, so the best thing to do was to drop out, which I did. So I never went into the reserve, and I never joined any veterans groups. Veterans groups were a big thing for World War I veterans. The American Legion and the VFW were big things because before World War II, you know, life was different. You didn't have all the social diversions that you have nowadays, so that's what a lot of the guys did. I remember growing up as a kid, there was guys in the neighborhood that belonged to the American Legion or the VFW, but I never joined any group.
And no, you didn't attend any reunions either?
Pardon?
No reunions?
No reunions? Yes, they have a reunion every year on the Yorktown is now a museum in Charleston, South Carolina. And they have a reunion there every year. And a couple of years ago they had it on the West Coast as a convenience to the people out there. But I've never attended, although I've been down to the Yorktown several times. And,
you know, the Lexington is a museum too down in Corpus Christi.
pardon?
The Lexington's a museum too down in Texas.
Oh, yes, yes. The reason I know where the Lexington is that it was built in the shipyard about 3/4 of a mile from where I grew up. And when I was working the shipyard for the Navy, I went aboard the Lexington while they were building it for a while. So I kept track of that a little bit. But it's a very expensive thing to maintain those.
It is.
In that same shipyard now, they have a cruiser that was built there right after the war, the Salem, and that's a museum, and they have trouble keeping it in condition. And even the Yorktown, when you go aboard it, it's not like it was when it was operating. When you had 4,000 or 5,000 guys to take care of it, they kept it spick and span. But and it's but it's still nice to visit. They have several planes on the hangar deck. They have SNJ, F6F. They have a B-25 on the aft end in the hangar deck. It's worth a trip. I've been there with my wife. I've been there with my son.
I'm going to ask my colleagues if they have any questions of you.
Take a break.
One question.
Is
You mentioned your wife. When did you get married?
When did I get married?
During the war or after?
I was discharged the 13th of September, and I was married the 25th of December.
Okay, 1945.
That's what my wife wanted. You can't fight that.
Why don't we take a break for?
Anything tried to come in on the fleet. And I heard the radio call come in that they sighted the Yamato, PBY flying boat, saw it coming down. What it was doing, it was making a suicide trip. It was going out, it didn't have enough fuel to get back. And that's one of their big troubles. They had no fuel because the submarines were sinking all the tankers coming up from the East Indies. So they were going out and just destroy as much of the fleet as they could. They had 18-inch guns. Our biggest battleships carried 16. So they could outrange it. But they sighted it, and down on the decks, everyone they could spare was in the air, heading out for it. And they had to keep some planes, actually, because we were flying CAP, and we would have to land pretty soon, and somebody take our place. But everything else that they could went up after that, and it was the Yamato and 3 destroyers, I think, and they blew it sky high. And this division skipper and the 3 guys with him in his division, the squadron skipper, and the 3 guys in his division, they had photo planes which had equipped with a camera. And there's a fellow from just the North Shore of Boston, a buddy of mine, he was in that division. And he took a photograph of the Yamato when it blew up. And it's a picture of that big cloud of steam and smoke and everything else in it. Classic picture. And that was the end of the large ships that Japanese had. That was the last one. They found it a few years ago. They went looking for it, and they found it in the ocean bottom.
Mr. Davis, you brought some items. You brought some items with you today?
Oh, yeah, I've got a lot of different things. A pad. This we used to wear on our leg to write on. This hooks on. Put it on your leg. We carried all sorts of gear. We always carried a .45 revolver. We carried a knife that we strapped in the leg here, and between that and I didn't bring my Mae West. That's the life preserver that we use. And then this thing we never had to use, fortunately. It's worn out. This is a signal mirror. It's a mirror on the front and a mirror on the back. And if you take this, and there was a little cross in this mirror, and you hold it up, and the sun comes through the cross and lands on your face. And when you line the reflection of that in here with the cross on your face, you'll be pointing right at whatever you're looking at. So that you want to signal a plane in the air, about the only way you can ever aim it, but this was very accurate. Fortunately, I never had to do that. This is a very pistol. Another thing we carry in a emergency pack that we sat on. Put in this shell here like a shotgun shell, and you just fire it. And it fires a red flare. There's another thing that you have, but you hope you never use. And the most important thing we had was what we call a small area parting board. And this is what we did our navigation on. It sit on a little tray, it slid in underneath the instrument panel. You'd slide it out, and you could, I've got it mounted on a piece of board to protect it because it's kind of fragile. But you could line up the grid and put, the always thing that you're concerned of is the wind. You put a wind vector facing into the middle. Then it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a heading, you put in your course to scale. That's these lines all so you can use it for scale. It's like a ruler. And you put in the wind, the course, and it'll tell you their heading, so you know which way to head. Of course, you only know the wind where you take off from. The problem is, when you get out there, what's the wind like? If you're 200 miles further out. But you could tell by looking at the water. If it's dead calm, you say it's 0 to maybe 5 knots. You can tell within 5 knots the wind speed. Then if you got just swells, 5 to 10 knots. If you got a little bit of white caps showing here and there, so more speed. So you could get the wind speed accurate enough to navigate as we did. But this is what we use. But it's easy when you're sitting here, but when you're got the stick between your knees to hold it while you're doing, and you try to make a straight line. But it's a very handy little thing. It just solves triangles, that's all it does. It's dead right. This is what the boaters used when they go out in the... I had a boss once, he was in the power squadron, he used to tell about his navigation. When the other guy looked at me, he says, what do you have to navigate for? If you're out off the coast, you just head west and you're going to hit the... you're going to hit you up pretty quick. But that's what we used. And I don't know, I was telling somebody about a logbook. I have 2 logbooks because the original one was down in the mechanics shop because they keep track of all the engine hours and the aircraft hours, and so they keep the pilot hours. And they had them stacked up on the shelf. And when the ship came under attack and started firing their 5-inch guns, it sounds like somebody's got a 20-pound hammer hitting on the bulkheads, and everything shakes. Well, it shook these right off the shelf into a bucket of gunk that they used to clean the grease in. And result is black insides. So they had to make a new, they copied it all over and then continued on with a new one that you can read. But I've got all sorts of stuff there. That's target maps. That's a target. That's a map of Okinawa, and it's squared off. And inside, each square is shown larger, so that if you can locate any particular point very closely. And we have those for. This one's Okinawa, we had Iwo Jima, and the different places we attacked. Oh, yeah. This is what they call a shackle code. When you need a code to encode something for the moment, we use the shackle codes. To a cryptographer, he could break this code probably in about a half an hour. But for information you want for just the moment, you use a shackle code. And when you transmit it on the radio, you could transmit regular information, text, but when you want to give a position, a distance, you would just put it in the shackle code. And it's good for a period of time. This particular one, effective from 2100, 9 o'clock at night, 12th of June to 2100, 13th of June. It's only good for a 24-hour period. And of course, everyone in the fleet has these, I had, only once that I had to use this. We raided an island, the Japanese, the name skips me right now, not Aishima, a small island just north of Japan. And the number 3 guy in our division got shot down. So we have a procedure, depending upon which guy goes down, that we swing into the other 3 planes. The division leader went down 100 feet to keep him in sight, because it's next to impossible to see somebody in the water. The only way you can see is on your life jacket, you have a dye pack. You open the dye pack, it'll stain the water for a 20-foot diameter circle with a yellowish green, and they can see that. So the division leader went down close. The second section wingman flew a couple of thousand feet as protection, and I had to go as high as I could get to give the report of a downed plane. And so I had to use the code to locate where we were. And that report went back to the ship, and the ship picked it up. So they sent 4 planes off immediately that were on the deck to take our place, because we're out of gas pretty near, and there's no gas stations on the way. So, and also, it's picked up by the Dumbo, flying boat, the air sea rescue ship. And he picked up the signal and headed out there. And we were going, the other planes got there first, and we took off, but he had come right along afterwards, so he just landed on the water and picked up the guy that was in the water and took them back to their base in Okinawa. They always flew out of the actual action area where they're safe, because they have no protection, you know. But I can remember one time we attacked a place in the southern end of Kariushu, and there's a big bay on the southern end, and there was a plane down in there. So he landed down and picked up the guy, and he says over the radio, he says, well, he says, I'll taxi you around down here on the water, he said, in case I have any more business. They're shooting at him from both shores, you know, and he's taxiing this big flying boat all around the bay. He said, let me know when you're done. So when we took off, somebody gave him a holler, and then he took off and went home. Crazy. But they were there. It's nice to know that. And toward the end of the war, there was always a submarine in the area. They knew where we were going to go, and they'd surface, sometimes fully, sometimes part way. That's the thing that rescued George Bush Sr., you know. He was flying a torpedo plane, and it went down, and the submarine picked him up. You know, they watched, and they could see somebody going down, they head toward him. Or if we get a report, you know, if somebody goes down and you report it, they pick it up and they head right over it. The only problem with that is that if you get a submarine that just got out on station, you're on the submariner for the next 3 months till he goes back home again. Because they don't go home just for you. They finish what they're doing. And, there's all things that put you a little more at ease. You know, you hope you don't need them, but you know that's a possibility at least. I thought of that when my engine quit one time over Kariushu. I was climbing back up to altitude and it just stopped. There's only one engine in that fighter. So what you do, you don't think, you react from all the training you've had, and you're doing 3 or 4 things at once. The first thing you do is turn toward the water to get as far out over the water as you can, because hoping the submarine can find you. And then you go about whatever else you have to do. Whether it's you change the propeller pitch, switch the thing to a full tank of gas, which if I had done before that, I wouldn't have stopped. But you don't know that. But you switch, and pretty soon the engine starts coughing, and it starts running again. And you say, what a klutz. So the dangers are not always from the enemy, you know, in these operations. There's 3 things that you have to worry about when you're in that area. One, of course, is enemy action. If you're attacked in a place, they don't want you there, and they fire everything they got. And the second thing is mechanical failure. These engines have got 100 parts, and they have to keep running. And the third thing, which is usually the biggest factor, is pilot error. You make mistakes, and usually you recover.
Now, you said when you got up to altitude, what was the normal altitude that you would be at?
Heading into a target, we usually head in maybe 10,000 feet. As we approach the target, maybe 10, 20 miles back, we start a gentle glide, go down around 7,000 feet, and then we go into an attack if we're going to bomb or rocket or strafe, whatever we're doing.
Now, was 10,000 feet the limit of the F6?
No. But it's the limit of most things that we did later in the war. Now, early in the war, they were flying, they'd take them up 20, 30,000 feet, you know. But there was no need of that. Everything took place below 10,000. After 10,000 feet going up, you have to use oxygen anyways. That's another pain in the neck, you know. So everything that we did was down low.
So this is the plane, huh?
Well, that's that's the F6. The only trouble is it doesn't have the belly tank on it. We always had a belly tank with 150 gallons, and that's why I get into trouble. Heading into the target, you run off the belly tank, but when you get close to the target, you switch onto a full tank. I didn't switch, and the belly tank ran out. But your instinct is to change tanks immediately when you have trouble.
Is that just a shot of a plane, or is that you in the plane?
No, that is just a plane. The only one I have in the plane is sitting in the cockpit of the F6. That's an actual Navy photo. I have a photo. If I have a photo there with the on the wing of the Hellcat with the division, yeah, these are the 4 guys I flew with. 3 guys and me, it's 4. That's taken aboard the Yorktown. I took a camera with me. I don't know if it's legal or not, but I had a camera. I could take the pictures, but I had no means to process them. But what I did have, when we were in Honolulu, I bought a development tank and some solution so I could develop the film. And then when I got home, I could make the prints and send them to the guys.
Now, do you remember the names of the fellows in that photo?
Oh, yes. Division leader is Stuart Ball, myself. The second section leader is Ralph Warner. He comes from Binghamton. And the third guy is Matty Williams, and he's from Washington State. And you can see the top of the tower in the background from the Yorktown. This is the plane that we flew. Nice plane. It takes a lot of damage. But I don't know. You want to see those? Well, Just a little bit of memory. This is the name tag we used to wear in the flight jacket. This is a Distinguished Flying Cross, and it's air medal.
Okay.
That takes
Just,
the top two
just,
of these.
I need to-
And that's just a World War II victory medal. That's the dog tags. These are cadet insignias. And then there's for areas, this is a Southwest Pacific area. That's and the gold star is for a second one, a bronze star. This, and the air medal is 2 gold stars. That means you get 2 additional ones. And then there's the Philippine Presidential Unit Citation, which is a citation for the whole group, you know, the whole air group. And I have the 2 because I was in both of those actions with 2 different air groups. I guess that about takes care of most of my couple of years.
There was his, that one.
Oh, look at that.
Oh, this is the certificate designated as Naval Navigator.
That's the one that you traveled all over the country to get? You're from Concord
That's the
to,
one that I spent 2 or 3 years sweating out, and they finally gave it to me. There were times when I wasn't sure. Even at, oh, that's the helmet. This is not like you see on the pilots nowadays. This is just the cotton helmet and the goggles. I was in preliminary flight training in Chicago, primary flight training, and I got 2 downs. Now you're only allowed 3 and they kick you out. So I'm on his 3rd check flight. And who do I get? But the guy with the biggest reputation for being a scrounge. So I groaned and moaned, and we went up. We were flying a yellow Parrot biplane, an open cockpit. And one of the things that you do, you have a circle on the ground, and you come down, and you kind of tip the plane up and slide down to land right in the middle of this. Well, we went out, and we come down. I missed it. Oh, let me show you. So he takes over, controls, he goes up, swings around, comes back in, tips it up, misses the circle. Oh! Then he went ballistic. He's swearing about all the things he told the plane riggers to do, that this plane isn't rigged right. It is. he flew it back to the base as quick as he could get there. There was steam coming out of his ears. I figure, boy, I'm done. He walks over the truck, puts a big up arrow, and walks off. I said, thanks to the guy that rigged the plane wrong. I missed another one. Oh, you know, these things are funny now, but you sweat them out during the time. You know. But,
is there anything else over there that you'd like to?
Yearbook.
that's a publication that one of the administrative officers in the air group was in the publishing business. So he gathered all sorts of information for Air Group 9's trip. And when we come home, he took all the information, and we paid him. I think officers gave him $20, the enlisted men gave him $5, and he took all the names and addresses, went home, made a book, and sent them out to everybody. And it's, in fact, I probably have a picture here of that, the Yamato. Well, maybe not. There's a picture of the ready room, with the pilot's ready room, where there's two rows of seats on either side of an aisle, you know, and everybody is assigned a seat where you pack up your gear. And these guys are all rigged up, ready to go. And when we had a pre-dawn launch, is to see at night, you know, the bright light kills your night vision. You see with two types of things in your eyes, rods and cones. And the daylight, regular vision is the cones, but the bright light blinds the others. So you have to be in the dark. It takes you 20 minutes in full darkness to get your eyes accommodated. So what we would do if we were going to launch at night, those cones are not affected by red light at all. So half an hour before the flight's due to launch, they shut off all the white lights in the ray room, and it's just the red lights. And then when you walk out of the ray room, which is right up underneath the hangar deck, you go out the walkway out and then up onto the deck in the dark, and you can see very well if you've been in that red light. And we often had pre-dawn launches.
Now, when you joined, what was your rank assigned when you first joined?
Aviation cadet.
Cadet.
Yeah.
And when you were discharged?
Ensign.
Ensign.
Yeah, I graduated from flight school as an ensign.
Okay. And when you finally discharged from the Navy?
It's still an ensign.
Ensign.
I run into a little trouble. I wasn't, because I changed air groups, so I wasn't along with them. I was due to be a JG when we were just in the process of leaving the area and coming home, and a lot of red tape. So.
Now, all the pilots were officers,
Yes.
is that correct?
Now, when the war started, there were enlisted pilots.
Mm-hmm.
But it becomes a little awkward operating that way. The Lexington had enlisted pilots on it when it was sunk, and as well as officers. But then they changed it. The enlisted pilots did a lot of the ferry work, the service work, and a lot of non-combat operations. But now all pilots are enlisted. Now the Japanese had enlisted and officer pilots both too. And they were even stricter in their separation than we were, you know. Most of our pilots took that kind of casual. They weren't big on ceremony and so forth. But because most of our time was spent during the war, and a lot of this ceremony and so forth, you put it aside. Yeah, it gets in the way.
Well, thank you very much for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Oh,
And
you're
your
welcome.
offer of letting us make copies of that is great. We'll try to do that before we let you go home. And
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. The only
Thank you.
problem I have is, memory is not what